la sesión de presentación del libro de la forma-comuna de Kristin Ross. Esta sesión será en inglés, así que si necesitáis traducción simultánea podéis escucharla a través del canal de Telegram de Nociones Comunes y ahí iremos traduciendo. Y nada, contaros que esta sesión se enmarca dentro de un curso que hemos organizado desde Nociones Comunes, que es el espacio de formación y autoformación de traficantes de sueños, en un curso o en un conjunto de sesiones que hemos llamado Habitar la lucha de la abolición de la familia a la forma-comuna. Entre otras muchas cosas, en el curso intentábamos poner a dialogar este texto junto con otros que acabamos de publicar desde nuestra editorial, que es Traficantes de Sueños, que son La abolición de la familia, el capitalismo y la comunalización de los cuidados, de Michelle O'Brien, y Disturbio, huelga disturbio, de Joshua Clover. En realidad nos parecía y poner en diálogo estos textos también con las luchas presentes y en particular con las que de una u otra manera estamos participando. Y en este sentido nos parecía importante el diálogo que establecían entre ellas, ya que abordaban la cuestión de la comuna, de la forma comuna en el presente y cómo la forma específica de las luchas que vienen, ¿no? Como que conectaba un poco con, a partir, por ejemplo, del texto de Joshua Clover, el de Disturbio, huelga disturbio, donde plantea un poco no solo el disturbio como la forma específica en la que de lucha en el contexto actual del capitalismo actualmente existente, sino su devenir histórico en la forma comuna, que es como termina el texto. Y esto enlazaba también con este otro texto que os comentábamos de O'Brien, donde igual poner el acento, en este caso, en lo que es la crisis de la reproducción social y el comprender también la abolición de la familia desde este proceso donde solo es posible a través de los momentos de lucha, y en esos momentos de lucha donde se produce lo que ella llama una reproducción social insurgente, es decir, donde la vida y la puesta de vida en común se ponen en el centro, y eso es capaz de generar unos horizontes colectivos, es decir, performar la forma de las revoluciones que vienen, ¿no? Entonces, estos dos textos como encajaban perfecto en esta idea, y el texto de Kristin nos parecía que también lo que intentaba era dar forma en particular a esto que veníamos llamando como la forma comuna, ¿no? Y establecía un poco esa relación, ese hilo rojo, esa resonancia entre las especificidades que podían contener esta forma comuna y empezar a intentar describirla y intentar entender también cuáles son los elementos que puedan hacer que esta forma comuna persista en el tiempo y se dé, ¿no? Cuáles son esas agregaciones, cómo se hace ese proceso de lucha que sea inteligente, cómo se construyen esas redes de afinidad, cómo se de alguna manera se conecta con ese hilo rojo de las revoluciones pasadas y futuras, como esa capacidad que pueda tener de resonar con esas energías insurgentes, con esas energías de emancipación, van a ser una de las claves que dé forma a esa práctica que es concreta, que es en el presente, que es en el hacer, pero que a la vez recoge toda esa lucha por el tiempo, todo ese saber acumulado y que es capaz de expresarse, de disponerse, de enfrentarse, de ponerse en acción en un momento determinado, ¿no? Y eso tiene también que ver con los momentos en los que no estamos en esa lucha, ¿no? Cómo construimos esas redes previas, cómo nos transmitimos esos saberes, cómo construimos esas resistencias, esos saberes que de repente en el momento en que la lucha se da son capaces de activarse y construir una geografía propia. Una geografía que sea capaz de empoderar y hacer presente y que esa capacidad de hacer todas se coloque en el centro, ¿no? de esas decisiones y transforme la propia subjetividad en esta y con ello pues, construya revoluciones presentes y futuras. Y en particular ella lo hace a través de conectar tres momentos históricos, ¿no? que son el de la Comuna de París, y entender así la comuna como un momento central de experimentación política, de los 70, la formación de campesinado francés y la memoria de lo que ha sido las zonas de defensa de los ZAD en Francia. Y en ese sentido, bueno, pues nos parecía que de alguna manera podía podía conectar fenomenal con las cosas que nosotras intentamos también reproducir en nuestros espacios ahora. Así que, sin más, la idea es que haga una presentación más o menos de unos 45 minutos y luego tendremos un ratito para debatir y demás. Así que, nada, muchísimas gracias y muchísimas gracias a Kristin por haberse animado. Y nada, contaros de ella en particular, que bueno, ha sido profesora de literatura comparada, es especialista en el siglo XIX y XX, y entre sus textos está bueno, uno de los primeros, que es sobre mayo del 68 y sus derivas posteriores, el surgimiento del espacio social, y ya los dos últimos que están bastante relacionados, que es el lujo comunal y este que vamos a presentar hoy de la forma-comuna, la lucha como forma de habitar. Así que nada, muchísimas gracias, Kristin.
Thank you very much, Amul, and the people from Traficantes and from Nociones Comunes for inviting me here to Madrid to speak a little bit about where I'm coming from, why I wrote this book. And I think I'd begin by saying that for some time I've been very interested in the question of political memory, and specifically the whole problem of when do moments from the past become meaningful for us? When do they enter into our present concerns? When do they become inspirational or even visible? It's not an easy question because it's not automatic. You can have a commemoration, a commemoration of some political event, and it might completely fall flat. It might be completely dead, and yet at other moments, suddenly, some moment from the past, some struggle, takes on an enormous significance for us and becomes a kind of we can enter into conversation with it. So it's a little abstract, but this is the problem that's guided my work for some time. And especially my work on the political memory of these great moments from the left, like May '68 or the Paris Commune, both of which are thought of in some way as French events, but actually exceed the national memory quite dramatically, the national context. And it was my work on the Paris Commune that caused me to be invited down to Western France, to the occupation that became known as the ZAD at Notre-Dame-des-Landes. Now, I'm thinking that most people here are familiar with that movement. Is there anyone who isn't? Okay. So they asked me to discuss with them the continuities and the discontinuities between what they were doing, attempting to block an international airport that the state wanted to build on farmland, and what the urban communards were doing in 1871. So the question was really, how do you put together this 19th century urban struggle of workers, essentially, with a much more heterogeneous paysan struggle in the 21st century, the 20th and the 21st century. So what could there possibly be in common between these two things? Now, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a political scientist, so when I begin something, when I start things, my background is in literature, so I tend to begin with particular scenes or particular moments of subjectivization, of people coming into political subjectivity. Instead of, say social scientists generally begin with some massive concept like justice. I do it another way. I start with the scene, and then, for example, when I wrote about the Paris Commune, I was trying to visualize the Paris Commune as a laboratory of political experimentation and see it as just these emancipatory processes at work that were devised by ordinary people. So, and this is precisely what Marx means when he talks about the working existence of the commune. That's what's significant, was simply the fact of it, the fact that it existed and that people carried on. So to do that involves, for me, restaging these events and restaging them in a way that is not necessarily the way they've been staged before. You know, you have to denaturalize them a little bit to make them visible and make them to create new things to say about the event, to see it from a different angle, to see it from a different perspective. So when I went down to Notre-Dame-des-Landes, this was a very creative moment in the history of the long struggle, which it's the ZAD was the longest struggle in post-war France. So technically it begins in the late 60s when the state decided to build this airport and began the whole process of designating the space and then trying to get the farmers to sell their land. And it was at that moment that some of the farmers said, no, we won't sell. And the whole thing began. And of course, there was a whole long period, over 20 years, when the state just took a long nap and forgot that they were even going to build an airport. And that was a very interesting moment. But then suddenly, then in the 2000s, you know, the state again said, okay, let's get started on this airport. And the farmers realized that they needed help, and they called in. They said, come, please. And people showed up and began to occupy the land with them to prevent any kind of building to begin. So that's, but at a certain moment, and this is right before I went down there had been a full-scale military intervention on the part of the government that sent in tanks and, you know, just wrecked all of the housing that they had built and attempted to have it lasted for a month, an actual back and forth with people in trees and, you know, just very violent. But they won, the state receded, and at that point they had to rebuild. They brought in new people, new supporters came from all over the country and beyond. And so they had succeeded, but then they thought, well, they were looking for new ways to keep the struggle going and to inhabit it in a different way. And a lot of them turned to Chiapas as a model, and others sort of went back in time. The others who were interested in the whole way in which the aesthetic is crucial to both individual and social transformation. And these zadistes sort of went back to the Paris Commune as a possible, not a model really, but as an archive of a usable archive of possible tools that you could use. And they were drawn to the idea of communal luxury, which is the central allegory I use to think about the Paris Commune. And like me, they were very intrigued by the oxymoronic logic of this phrase that I found in the manifesto that the artists and artisans of the commune wrote. And they said they were for communal luxury. Well, isn't luxury, by definition, what belongs to just a few people? So what could communal luxury possibly mean? it is really, this wasn't a big slogan of the Paris Commune, but I think it is at the heart of their thinking, because it's a figure for human flourishing beyond material needs, and a figure for useful production and equality in abundance, which means an idea of luxury that is not founded on class division. So I also thought that it was a useful idea to create a bridge to the present, because in that way I could reactivate some of the debates that the communards had about art, about labor, about social space, and and try to bring that into the present in a world that is only now just beginning to try to entertain again the idea, under the most dire ecological circumstances, the idea that it's possible to live better by producing less, and by working and consuming and living differently. So a life where subsistence becomes abundance, because we're not all desperately accumulating all of the time. So these, I think, are the key aspects of what I call the commune form. And I'll talk more about those aspects, but I just want to make a quick remark about the larger historical argument that I make in the book, which has to do with these territorial movements, like the ZAD or a couple of the others that I talk about at some length in the book, Sanrizuka in Japan, the movement to block the building of the Narita airport, another long, 10-year, very, very violent peasant struggle. And then others in the Americas, Standing Rock, and more recently, Stop Cop City outside of Atlanta. That I'm not sure you all would be familiar with, but we can talk about that and the others in the discussion perhaps. But it's clear that in the case of all of these occupations, they are very important in the way that they intervene frontally against the accelerated destruction, the capitalist destruction of the lived environment. And you can't make the case that these local territorial movements are prepared to reverse all of capitalism in one fell swoop, but they are movements of self-defense that block or interrupt the material expansion of capitalism. So they offer a more pleasurable way of life. So this is, I think, what is their major effects. And then in the book, I also wanted to make the case that they change the way that we view recent history, because they bring into visibility moments moments really years, but precisely struggles like the Larzac in France, which was another 10-year struggle on the part of sheep farmers to block their land being taken over by the government for an army camp. And then the airport struggle in Japan. These two movements are usually thought of as the tail end of the 1960s, like the sad waning of political energy. It's almost as though the idea was that if you got off the urban streets and you switched your focus to the countryside, that was the end of politics somehow. But I think that the form that the current ecological movements are taking, like the ZAD, changes the way we see those earlier movements in the countryside and brings them to the forefront in a way so that they become very much the significant the significance of what constituted what we think of as the 60s and the 70s. They become we can perceive them now to be what was crucial about what was going on at the time. So the contemporary struggles also give new names to what we can remember about the recent past. And one of these names is the title of the book, the commune form. So, and I think that by beginning with precise situations of social struggles, what the people that were doing them, the words they were using, the debates that they had, the words they stopped using, all of this becomes very important to go back to. And by restaging them, what I wanted to do was to postulate the existence of a form that gathers together all of these experiences, a very political form. And when I say form, I'm not talking about any kind of pre-established model or a static, blueprint of goals or anything like that. It's rather a kind of an oppositional process and a working out that is intensely situational. So it can't unfold in the same way everywhere, like a concept. It's, and if I even mention the Paris Commune in the background there, I'm not saying that the ZAD at Notre-Dame-des-Landes was a reincarnation of the Paris Commune or anything like that. I'm saying that each of these instances are manifestations of a social form that flourishes when the state withdraws, when the state becomes either dysfunctional or distant or can be made redundant by the activation of certain kinds of skills or people taking into their own hands their own care, their own way of life. And this is a political movement that is also a collective elaboration of a way of life. And, people like Kropotkin or Marx, they think of it as a very archaic form, and it is in many ways, and it changes. I mean, Kropotkin thought it goes back to the French Revolution, and he has one of the best brief statements for thinking about the commune form. He says, it's the necessary setting for revolution and the means to accomplish it. So the setting becomes the means. In other words, the creation of the space is the revolution. Marx says basically the same exact thing. This is one of these moments where Marx and the anarchists come together in an absolute way. Marx says it's the context of revolution and also the content. So it's an identical phrase, and it's very striking. Okay, the other major things that you can say very quickly about it, it's about the art and the organization of everyday life. It's about people collectively and individually taking responsibility for subsistence. And it's always linked to a space. It's always linked to a neighborhood, a territory, a specific milieu. And so when I thought about writing a book like this, as a historian, I wanted to try to specify the form. I had to go back to resituating each of these movements. And that's because the commune form is always situated. It's always in action. It cannot be abstract because it's about building or creating spaces in the literal sense of the term. It's actually about building spaces. So the book is in large part an exercise in relocalizing or restaging. Now, I want to just say a few remarks about some of the practices that make up the political intelligence of the commune form. And the first one is I've always been very interested in questions of why, people are always telling us to resist, but whenever I hear that, I always think, oh no, the game is over. I mean, because resistance means already that we've lost, right? And or that we've, that the power, we're attributing the power to the other side, and we have to absolutely resist it. And I've always been much more interested in defense, because defense starts from another point. It starts from something you already have and something that you love. So it begins with love. It begins with something that you cherish enough that you want to defend it. And to me, that's far more powerful, because it means that you are setting the agenda. You and not the state. So when we resist, we're letting the state set the agenda. And I've noticed with each of these, especially these very long movements like Narita or the Larzac or the Zad, you start out by beginning to defend something, maybe your neighborhood, some unpolluted farmland, or something territorial that you begin with. But over time, what you're defending actually changes radically, because you end up defending the social movement and the way of life that you've created together in the act of defending. And that then becomes the grounds for the defense. So there's a very interesting kind of historical evolution to these movements that begin that way, that begin with defense. Okay, the second thing I talk about a lot is appropriation, and I mean that in the specific sense that Henri Lefebvre uses it. He uses it very strongly. And I went back to a number of the anti-productivist thinkers of the 1970s. They became the important thinkers for me in this book, and that means Guattari, André Gortz, Maria Mies, Silvia Federici, but above all, Henri Lefebvre, who's always been very important to me for some time with his critique of everyday life. And all of these thinkers are like Lefebvre in the sense that they come to ecological concerns through thinking about everyday life. That's their trajectory. And this it involves them, this group of thinkers were really the first to begin to theorize political spaces outside of the workplace, for example. And it's Lefebvre who thought about the creation of what he called appropriated spaces. And these are spaces where desires and relations that are not reducible to the economic can flourish. And it's important for him when he thought about the creation of these reappropriated spaces, or the, which also involves really inventing other forms of temporality as well. He thought of that obviously not as a possession, but rather as something closer to a work of art. He used that French word œuvre. He says it's an œuvre. It's not a possession, it's a collective œuvre, a collective work of art. And he took the argument one step further when he said he actually thinks that a place of one's own collectively is a prerequisite for class struggle. It's a prerequisite for social revolution. You cannot even begin, whether you're a group or an individual, you cannot become a political subject unless you appropriate and build together a space. And a space, both a physical space and a social space. So it's quite an amazing idea, actually. It means that really all of that once again, it's the commune is the context and the content, right? Essentially, social revolution is nothing but the building of communes. So, and what that means really is that this idea is far more demanding, it's far more exigent than a mere idea or a mere theory, because it presupposes existential transformation. You actually have to change the way you're living rather than simply theorize, or, you have to live differently. Okay, the third, and this is, to me, and this is probably one of the most interesting, and this is a process that I think was born at the ZAD, and it's what they call composition. And it is an answer to the question of, well, who are these people? Who are these people who are engaged in actually living differently, in creating a social space that they manage and themselves? Well, they're not a political party. They're not a social class. They're not generational. They are, the commune form is far more socially inclusive than, say, a factory, or in that it includes the aged, other species, animals, the unemployed, the employed, children. So composition is the creation of a polemical political community, a very polemical one, in that not everyone in the composition shares the same political codes. It's also the production of a people that is different from the people that can be seen and counted by the state. It's a different entity. And it's a very pragmatic response to the phenomenon that Henri Lefebvre, again, noted way back in the 1970s when he said that any battle over space necessarily creates an alliance of the most diverse people you can imagine. So, which is very interesting, the idea that that space and ecological combat necessarily brings together people of very diverse backgrounds, ideologically, identitarian. It puts to it actually makes various kinds of identitarian and ideological concerns recede into the background. Because what becomes more important is the shared experience that's creating this coalition against a shared enemy. So the idea is that battle lines over land draw lines of solidarity differently than battles over, say, abstract ideas. And coming back to defense, what strikes me about the defense movements is that they do create a much stronger solidarity than say, resistance. The kinds of general assemblies that I saw at Notre-Dame-des-Landes were amazing because they went on forever. But you'd have old farmers who tended to be quite conservative and very concerned with animal protein, unlike some of the newer farmers who were against animal protein, but they'd be right next to each other, just farming the same land, you know. And then you'd have black bloc anarchists, very open to frontal struggle with the police, people who were very nonviolent. Violence, and neither violence nor nonviolence was fetishized, okay? It was both were perfectly fine. You had elected officials, you had lawyers, you had people who really knew the legal system, you had naturalists who didn't even believe in agriculture, you know, who just believed in rewilding everything. So it was an amazingly varied group of people who, for years, managed to share a territory and a political struggle. So, and this is what composition is about. You know, as one friend down there said, it's more about tact than tactics. I don't know if you can do that with the translation. All right. Okay, so what the effect of composition is, it produces a kind of solidarity in extreme diversity that I think is part of this massive investment in organizing everyday life in common without the kinds of exclusions that we all know from the long history of the left, various kinds of identitarian exclusions or ideological exclusions, and all of the, you know, sectarianism that we've all known. So it's a way of remaining multiple while nevertheless weaving together the necessary practical alliances. I think a lot like what you all are doing here in Madrid, from what I can see, with all of your various cousins, as I think it was Vivian always was referring to the cousins, you know. I mean, I don't know if a family analogy is the right one to use after M.E. O'Brien, but it is like a cousinship anyway. And so the non-identity and the unstable structures of the commune are the strength and motor of its working existence. And what composition shows is that it's not only possible, but it's actually desirable to work and ally with people who don't necessarily share your political code. Insofar as the enemy is shared and the enemy is clearly designated, and insofar as solidarity extends to all of the different groups that are involved and that have committed themselves, and that equality is presumed in an almost a Jacques Rancière's sense of presuming equality from the outset. Of the people who have decided to act together, And that is what goes into building this polemical political community. And I just want to make the point that why this is so important is that it works. It's a very pragmatic point. It works. And it works because, at least in the case of the Zad, the reason why the Zad succeeded in the long battle that they fought with so many elements in acting differently with completely different methods. You know, all the people who were knowledgeable about the law, who were just filing delay after delay and working the courts, the anarchists who were fighting the cops in the street and in the fields, the punks who had all sorts of improvisational know-how, the other kinds of anarchists who were knowledgeable about squatting, the naturalists who were busy charting the endangered species of the zone that would be, you know, destroyed if the airport were built. All of these different methods worked, and you can't forget the founding fathers, in a way, the old farmers who had enormous social status, right? So what that did was it combined to make a form that had an endlessly changing offensive that made it very, very difficult for the state to either subsume them or conquer them or pacify them. So it reminds me again of another statement of Kropotkin's, that solidarity is not a feeling, it's not an ethical, it's not an ethos, it's not a feeling. It's actually a revolutionary strategy, and it's the most important one. Okay, so defense, appropriation, composition, these are the elements that make, I think, the commune form one of the best ways that we have to come to terms now with the social conditions that are ours. Now, I wanted to write a very short book, and I think I succeeded. And the reason I did that was because when it comes to capitalism's destruction of the lived environment, we already know everything. We know everything there is to know. We probably have known everything since 1962, when Rachel Carson published The Silent Spring. We probably even knew everything back in the 1920s, when you had people like Jacques Ellul in France and Charbonneau and other people, you know, writing about that. It could be that we've known everything since the late 19th century, when, you know, communards like Élisée Reclus or William Morris or the other people I talk about at the end of Communal Luxury, they were already completely aware of what capitalism's effect on the environment was back then. So if we already know everything, then there's no use predicting catastrophe any longer, or gathering more data, or repeating prophecies that will undoubtedly actually become true, that there's no way for us, that things have become too complex for us to intervene into directly. And I think that what the Zad and movements like that show us is that it's actually very possible to seize hold of the machine and throw it into reverse. You actually can do that. And that it's action that creates dreams and desires and not the reverse. So to conclude, I just want to say a few more remarks about the conclusion that I use at the book, which is to turn to the movement of soulèvement de la terre, which at this very moment is establishing a set of priorities and passing openly into the offensive against the seizing of land in France. And I can't remember who I was speaking to, but it's an amazing moment in France. I know it's very different in Spain. I've learned that since I've been here in a couple of days. But in France, 50% of the land is still agricultural, 50%. And of that 50%, half of it is going to change hands in the next 5 to 10 years, which means that half of that land is either going to become annexed into agricultural industry, industrial agriculture, into, agro-business, or it will be paved over, unless, something is done, unless that land is defended in some way. So Soulèvement is a group that came organically out of the ZAD. It's many of the same people, and joining with other groups and they've made a conscious choice that their goal is simply about that, defending agricultural land. So they're not concerned with fossil fuel or any of the other, various things that one can be concerned about. They're simply focused on that. And what that means is that they're attempting to amplify and link together what are various local struggles, right? And against agro-industry, it's their primary, but also against polluters, against the entire, was it Dwight Eisenhower who talked about the military-industrial complex? I think it was. Anyway, they talk about the agro-industrial complex. And it's a useful term because it includes everything from seed patenting, pesticides, the banks that provide the loans to the farmers, the machinery production, the zoning laws. You can see the distribution in grocery stores. Every single huge asset. It's an enormous industrial complex, which they are trying step by step to dismantle. And dismantling is one of their terms. It's a very useful term. You can read about it in their own book, which I think has been translated, right, into Spanish? I think it has, or it will be. And, once again, it's a movement that anyone can join. It's not a class, it's not a party, it's not generational, but it's highly organized. And it's the form, again, that interests me because I see it as, once again, a variation of the commune form in that, to go back to the Paris Commune, when the survivors of the massacre came together in exile in places like Switzerland and London, what they talked about as their greatest problem was their isolation in Paris, their utter isolation. They were isolated from other communes that were starting in other cities like Marseille and Lyon, and they were utterly isolated from any possible comrades that they could have had in the countryside. And they were isolated from any kind of subsistence that they could gather from the countryside. So they were, they were resorting to passenger pigeons and, various ways of trying to communicate, but they were utterly isolated. And so they saw, what they learned from that was the importance of something that they thought of as federation, how to federate with other movements, with other, with other similar or analogous or related movements that are happening simultaneously. And in effect, I think that Sous le monde de la terre has really solved that problem, because they always begin with the actions of a specific milieu, the specific ecological problems of, a vineyard in the mountainside, or a community garden out in a suburb, or and these are already existing local movements. And then soulèvement, in effect, creates a way for them to communicate with others. And in that sense, they really have resolved the problem that eluded the communards in the 19th century. And in so doing, they've created what we could think of as a common horizon of situated struggles. They've managed to take extremely precise, local, practical problems and turn it into a more global kind of ambition. So I think I'll stop there.
Pues ahora, si os apetece, tendríamos un ratillo para preguntar, diálogo, lo que un poco os apetezca.
Atlanta que ha comentado antes, a lo mejor. El caso de Atlanta, la lucha en Atlanta, en Estados Unidos.
Oh, sure. Do you know about it at all? It was a very interesting. Outside of the city of Atlanta, right on the edge, is a virgin forest, a beautiful old virgin forest that's also right next to the a working class black neighborhood. So it's their green space. They use it as their green space. And the state decided that it was going to level this forest and build a police training ground. And this is beyond belief. So they completely destroy the forest, build a police training ground, and in the training ground, they were going to build a fake black neighborhood for the cops to practice on. And the instructors that they were going to bring were police from Israel. No, it was beyond belief. So this movement started with people occupying the trees. So people moved into the trees, and for 2 years, they lived in the trees. And it was a very well composed, it was definitely a movement of composition in the sense that the very different groups, school children would bring food that would be brought up for the trees, you know, there was, the university's students were involved, the Black community was involved. So it was a very interesting movement and very inspirational to other areas of the United States. Unfortunately, it failed, and not only that, the police killed one of the occupiers who was just sitting there peacefully. They tried to remove everybody, and they shot him 52 times. So he became the first, I should say she because it was a trans person, and became the first ecological martyr in the United States. A bit like Rémi Fraisse in France, who was, I think, the first to be killed by the police in France. But you know, it's interesting because on the question of failure, I don't know what to think about that. I've always had a hard time deciding what was success and what was failure. In the case of the Larzac in France, that was a big success. They finally won. But Narita was a failure, you know, they lost. The airport obviously Narita airport was built. Although that airport was a failure, you know, it's been a disaster the entire history of that airport. But, so even though, you know, you can have the outcome go either way, it's still the fact of, once again, the working existence of these movements is perhaps what counts the most in terms of the future.
Ahora, sí. I will try in English. If not, maybe Isidro can translate me. I was wondering how could we possibly talk, and in fact, how could we act in an internationalist way in struggles that are based, in some sense, on a commune form or similar forms, because I found it easy, at least in my imagination, when we organize in a party or something like that, but I do not organize in a party. I am in a squad here in Madrid, and I strongly believe in territorialized struggles. But the things in the world now are getting very bad, there's war, etc. So there's an actual need of gathering different struggles, different experiences in an international scale, but not from above, but from below. So, but I find maybe not a limit, but a thing to think there. And I think that in the other book, you talk in some way of internationalism, because all these expatriated people made encounters, etc. Well, that's my question.
Well, you know, yeah, I mean, if you go back to the first international, which was the group that made the Paris Commune, that was really the only. What was that internationalism based on? It was based on the working class, right? I mean, it was an internationalism of workers. And I don't think that that kind of internationalism pertains any longer. It's not, I mean, I don't think that we create our solidarities entirely or even necessarily on the basis of work or looking for work or working conditions. We still do in some ways, but that's not necessarily the primary thing. So then, what then becomes the basis for an international movement? And I suppose that you have to look at these other forms of dispossession, right? That we're not just dispossessed of our labor power or the kinds of economic dispossession that was the basis for the solidarity of the First International. It's got to be other forms of dispossession, the way in which we're dispossessed of, say, aesthetic pleasure or our environment, or that has to become the ground of some sort of solidarity at the international level. And I was really struck by, once again, like there was always an amazing amount, despite the fact of these very localized movements like the ZAD, the enormous effort that they made towards creating something larger than themselves. And that was done through something that people in France are very good at, which is these support groups, like the creation of a support Notre-Dame-des-Landes group in every single city in France, so that it becomes a kind of a focal point that is in and of itself a kind of inspiration for other movements. But I think you're absolutely right that it has to do that. But also they made a lot of effort to be active in struggles that weren't their own, and also to form ways of meeting up and communicating with. I remember I was in a forest in Notre Dame, and I went around the corner, and there were 6 Mexican women coming towards me, and they had all come from Chiapas, And so, I mean, there was always a lot of communication.
Okay, I'll make a question myself. When I mean, I can totally see the interest in talking about SAD and Notre-Dame-des-Landes as a way of constructing an example of struggles in a moment where, because at the end of the day, what I find totally surprising is that at the moment where the ecological crisis is deeper, ecological, let's say like ecological thinking, political thinking is at its low, at its lowest.
Right now?
Yeah, yeah, as a global discourse, right? Of course, it's good to take like good examples from the territory and say, this can work, yeah. It is also good to set up in a historical frame, of course, but I would say that it's a very, very French example. Yeah. In so far as there is a revolutionary tradition in the countryside in France, which is, I think, is the only example in Europe. In the end, in the rest of Europe, the peasants have been completely eradicated, right? And it's got to do with properties, how the property regime is built up. In Eastern Europe, there wasn't even property as we know it. Now they are, Bauern are discovering struggles in Germany now, of course. So, Ben, what I would like to is maybe because what I think we need now, I mean, we need many things, but to talk about cities.
Yes. Well, yes, I think
yeah,
you're right.
because cities are ecosystems in the same, are where the vast majority of us live, and is not really thought as a territory of struggles. It's
Sure it
as a
is. Well, the Paris
not
Commune.
in the same.
No,
yeah,
no.
but yeah.
Yeah.
But I'll put an example. Minneapolis.
Yes.
Yeah. In every sort of full-fledged urban struggle, there is a commune. I think about Portland within Black Lives Matters. Just picking up those examples and building on them can maybe, because like getting big overarching theories don't come out from one day to another. So it's little building blocks, right?
No, I completely agree with you, and I think you're right, because it is very French. It has to do, again, with their particular history and the fact that that agricultural land in France is not completely over, you know, and still remains to be defended. The idea that they would decide to put the whole question of land and access to land at the center of political debate has everything to do with their history, right? And but it's not just French. I'll argue with you I think you're right about Europe, but certainly in the Americas, in Australia, in Brazil, in Canada, you know, so that's where the connections would be, or even in, you know, Rojava, you know, you could say. Okay, so, but I think you are right about Europe, and yet there's nothing about the commune form that is particularly rural, despite my examples. It's, and even something like Stop Cop City is sort of, you know, it's urban and, you know, it's suburban in a way, yeah. But sure, I mean, that, yeah, there is nothing particularly necessary about the question of rural land to the commune form. And you're absolutely right about Minnesota. I had the exact same. I wasn't in the U.S. during the whole thing with Alex Preddy, but in the way that people were talking about the activity of people in Minneapolis and the way that they had used the historical memory of the George Floyd movement, which had occurred right in the same neighborhood, to build on the already existing political networks and relationships that they had, to create these ways of surveying ICE. And that's what drove ICE crazy, was the idea that they were being surveyed, right? And then also to do that very pragmatic, practical acts of picking up the food for the migrants, making sure that the kids got to school safely, and picking the kids up from school, and all of those daily kinds of everyday life activities. So yeah, I think Minnesota is a really good example, and thank God, you know, because there's not much of a good example of anything coming out of the United States at this point.
Lo dejaríamos aquí. Para nosotras era muy importante poner en el centro las luchas por el territorio, las luchas por la reproducción de la vida como lugares de conflicto, la forma en la que el motín, que también es una forma específica que permite, bueno, o histórica nuestra, y que cuando sigue en el tiempo adopta esta forma, y en particular nos parecía importante el repensar cómo se construyen en estos momentos, ¿no?, entre que estalla un motín y otro, todas esas redes, cómo pensamos en todas esas alianzas, todos esos lugares que son pequeños experimentos que al final permiten construir las comunas que vendrán. Así que muchísimas gracias por este rato y por lo que nos queda por pelear juntas. Así que...